Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And, pardon me, I just have to say a word about how much I appreciate so very, very much the growing viewership on YouTube of my Now TV presentations. And as many of you know, Now TV recently expanded their viewership by literally millions of homes. Now, those of you who watch me on YouTube know I very, very, very seldom ask for financial support for our ministry. Uh, we have had a core group of supporters for years that have been so wonderfully faithful, but unfortunately, time changes things. Illness, deaths, loss of jobs, especially during COVID and what have you. Now, in order for us to expand our viewership on Now TV, okay, they don't automatically put us on that added viewership. And they expanded their potential audience by over 100 million homes recently. Well, in order for Morning Musings to get onto those additional home viewerships, we need some additional financial support. Now, this is an opportunity that is really unprecedented for our ministry, for the entire movement of covenant eschatology. So, if you would like to help to help Preterist Research Institute, to help the movement, the truth of covenant eschatology spread throughout the world in an unprecedented manner, let me urge you, let me request that you please consider supporting Now TV through Preterist Research Institute. You know, if you just sent money to Now TV, we would not get any of it. That wouldn't benefit our ministry here on Morning Musings. So go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and send us an email. And tell us how you would like to support our ministry. And again, we've had such wonderful support down through the years. Thankfully, we haven't had to ask for support very, very often. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, guess what, folks? We have lost a very substantial amount of monthly support. I mean, a substantial amount. And I haven't come asking you for support up to this point, but that time has come. We need your financial support. I know it's been difficult. I know it's difficult on countless families. So many people are affected by it. But perhaps there are some of you out there pardon me, that have not suffered financially from COVID, and you'd be able to help us to expand our reach to literally hundreds of millions of more homes. Think about that, folks. Hundreds of millions additional homes as a potential audience. I mean, that's literally mind-blowing. Okay, that's all the time I want to take for that. As I've said before, I absolutely hate asking for money, but that time has come. And so we need your help. We are continuing our study. I apologize for my difficulty in speaking this morning. I got to go to an automotive swap meet Friday and Saturday, and there were so many people there, and I talked and I talked and I talked. Imagine that. And so I'm having a little bit of difficulty. My voice is tired, but I'm going to do the very best that I can in order to bring the message to you this morning. Remember, for well over a year, we're approaching 2 years on Now TV, I've been sharing with you the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ is, very simply stated, Jesus said, "Do not believe me for my word's sake, believe me for my works." if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. One of those works that the Father gave him, we can say the crowning work that the Father gave to the Son was to be the judgment, his parousia, and the resurrection. That was to be the climax of his eschatological work, and at that time he would sit down with the Father in the throne and rule forever and forever. On the throne of David, reign without end. Luke chapter 1, 32 and 33. So, the skeptics, the atheists, the agnostics, the Jews and the Muslims, they tell us, they will tell you, Jesus did not keep his word. I read some comments on the internet just this week from atheists about how Jesus failed. Now, I have said to you before, I will continue to say this. And I had a visitor come to town over the last couple of weeks, and he and I sat down and had a great time together, had a great visit together. And he actually came, I guess, a couple of weeks ago now. I'm terrible on time. Anyway, he has an outreach that is worldwide. We had a fantastic visit. I think I made a friend there. So anyway, we were talking about the challenge of Christ and how critical it is that the modern church be able to meet this challenge, because historically the church has not done a good job of answering the challenge of Christ. Do not believe me if I do not do what the Father gave me to do. And yet, in pulpit after pulpit after pulpit, in just a couple of days, this program is airing on Friday. In just a couple of days, on Sundays, in Christian churches in the Western Hemisphere, and then, whatever the day difference is in the other hemisphere, Christian ministers are going to get up, and in many of them, not all of them by any means, thank the good Lord, but in many pulpits across Christianity, those ministers are going to say, well, we just have to face the fact that, yes, Jesus said, and his apostles taught, he was coming back in the first century. Now, we all know he didn't do it, but we just have to keep on believing. And yet Jesus said, if I do not do what the Father gave me to do, do not believe me. Folks, this is how critical the challenge of Christ is. And so I have been sharing with you how the modern church can meet the challenge of Christ. We don't have to surrender the message of the gospel. We don't have to admit, well, yes, we know that Jesus said he was going to do it, and we know he didn't. Look, John MacArthur, one of the noted modern-day evangelical scholars, says there's no question whatsoever that Jesus seemed to indicate and that the apostles believed he was coming back in that generation. Of course, we know that. And John MacArthur says, and the skeptics have a field day with Jesus' statements and with the apostles' declaration. And John MacArthur doesn't know how to answer the challenge of Christ. He says, well, you see, the reason Jesus didn't come back in the first century was that God wants the church of every generation to be on the tiptoe of expectation, that's his terminology, of believing that the Lord is coming back in their generation. No, folks. Jesus said, he didn't say, now just hope for it every generation. He said, some of those standing here will not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. There is no simple hope so. There is no simple keep on hoping. There is no, now just keep standing on the tiptoe of expectation. No. Verily I say unto you, a double affirmation that it was going to happen. And then we are presented with the dilemma. This is where the challenge of Christ and the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Evangelical Christianity, traditional Christianity, has said, well, the coming of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event. It's the last day of time, the last day of human history. One of the adversaries of covenant eschatology, who posts on Facebook all the time, is constantly saying, hey, look, last day means last day. And that means it's got to be the last day of every single thing. That is such an illogical, false, it's an absurd statement. Keep this in mind. Daniel was told that there were 1,290 days and then 1,335 days. From the time of the abomination of desolation until the consummation, until the end, until the resurrection. So let me ask you a question. At the end of that designated, appointed time of 1,290 and 1,335 days, would that be the last day? Well, of course it would be. It would be the day of the resurrection. No doubt about that. And yet Daniel was told, and you see we're back to Daniel chapter 12 in our discussion of the challenge of Christ. Daniel chapter 12, verse 6 and 7 emphatically tells us that the resurrection was going to be when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered. Well, the holy people was Old Covenant Israel. Their power was her covenant relationship with the Lord, and that was destroyed, shattered, ended in AD 70. You know how I know that, by the way? Zechariah chapter 11, 6 and following, the Lord said, in the day, and by the way, this is written well after the fall of Jerusalem in BC 586, and the Lord said, in that day, as a result of Israel's violation of Torah, they would eat the flesh of their children. Now that's in fulfillment of the law of blessings and cursings of Deuteronomy chapter 28 to 30 that said in Israel's last days, Israel would eat the flesh of her children in the siege, in the war. Well, guess what? It would be in that day, according to Zechariah chapter 11, verse 8 and 9, that God would break his covenant bond with both houses of Israel. He would bring the Mosaic covenant to its end. That happened in AD 70. If you're familiar at all with Josephus, the Jewish historian who was present at the destruction of Jerusalem, and he reports how a woman killed her child during the famine that overtook the city, and she roasted him and ate that child. Here's Zechariah chapter 11 being fulfilled in AD 70, and it's at that time that God said, I will break my covenant with both houses of Israel. Now, to move on, all right? My point here was that we have Daniel who foretold the resurrection when the power of the holy people be completely shattered, and we have Zechariah chapter 11 emphatically and specifically telling us when that would be, what the shattering of the holy people would be, and when it would be, and we have an eyewitness report who saw it all happen. How do we deny this kind of thing, ladies and gentlemen? Well, you see, here is Daniel chapter 12 predicting the resurrection, which is the time of the day of the Lord, right? Everyone agrees with that. But that's the time of the end. It's the last day. But that last day resurrection would be when? Oh, when Israel ate the flesh of their own children in the siege of Jerusalem, when God broke his covenant with both houses of Israel. He terminated his covenant with them. They would no longer be his distinctive covenant people. That can only be AD 70, ladies and gentlemen. It fits to the T. Now, what that means is, since the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12 would be fulfilled when the power of the holy peoples would be completely shattered, and since the resurrection is the day of the Lord, then that means that the day of the Lord was in AD 70, which means this. It means the day of the Lord is not an earth-burning, time-ending event. It is when God and when Jesus, to whom the Father had committed all judgment, when Jesus used the Romans to destroy Jerusalem. Do you see that? Listen, folks, this is the answer to the challenge of Christ. There's no one that can refute this. It is literally irrefutable. And yet, Bible teachers, preachers, all well-intentioned men, I am not questioning even for a moment their love of the Lord or their desire to please the Lord. No. I'm not questioning that. But I can tell you this, there are thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Christian ministers out there who have never dealt with the challenge of Christ. And let me share a very quick anecdote with you here. Some years ago, I had a booth at the Abilene Christian University lectureship, and we would pass out literature. We would confront people with the challenge of Christ. And the huge majority of the people that came by our booth were ministers, or they were elders, they were deacons. They were teachers in the church. And I will never, ever forget on this one occasion, I kept noticing that just down the aisle in the display area, just down the aisle, I kept noticing this fella. He would step out into the aisle and he would just look down the aisle at us. William Bell, my good friend, who has a program on Now TV on Saturday afternoons. You need to catch him. But he would just stand in the aisle and he'd look down the aisle at William Bell and me. Sometimes the looks were not all that friendly. Well, when he would see me looking at him, he would very quickly, just turn away. And once in a while, I'd give him a great big wave, say hi, never acknowledge me. Well, I walked by his booth several times, going to the concession stand, getting a cup of coffee, what have you. Totally ignored me. He'd turn away. Finally, on one trip, I'm starting to come up to his booth, and he didn't see me immediately. And then he saw me, and I said, "Hey, how you doing?" I'm fine. And then he goes, okay. I want to know what it is you guys are teaching. He said, I'm hearing people talk about you, and I want to know what it is you're teaching. You know what I did? I presented to him the challenge of Christ. Here's what Jesus said. If I do not do what the Father gave me, do not believe me. Here's what Jesus said he was given to do to come back in judgment in the first century. And I asked him how he dealt with that. And he just stood and looked at me. And finally he said, "Okay, what's your answer to that?" He said, "Yeah, that's the challenge of Christ." I began to share with him, and I stood right there in that aisle for close to 45 minutes, sharing with him the answer to the challenge of Christ. And after sharing with him some of the things that I've been sharing with you here on Now TV, the fellow finally said, do you know what? I just retired a month ago, I think it was, after 50 years in the ministry. He said, do you want to know how I dealt with the issue of eschatology? I said, don't have any idea. And he said, these were his words, I did the Passover on it. When I would come to verses that talked about the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the time of the end of the age, what have you, he said, I would tell my congregation, I don't know how to explain this. So we're going to move on. I said, well, that was a little bit troublesome, wasn't it? Since, according to some figures, eschatology is mentioned once every 26 verses in the Bible. You know, by ratio. And he said, oh yeah. And he said, I'm ashamed to say it. But he said, why didn't I know what you just shared with me? He said, I could have shared it for 50 years. And he said, I'm ashamed to say, I had no clue what the answer was. He said, this is incredible. Listen, folks, I've taken a lot of time this morning, sharing these preliminary things with you. So let's get back to our discussion. Now, one more time, very, very, very quickly. Remember, the day of the Lord is the day of the resurrection. Everyone agrees with that. The resurrection would be when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. The time when the power of the holy people, i.e. Old Covenant Israel, was completely shattered would be the day in which they would eat the flesh of their children in the siege of Jerusalem, Zechariah chapter 11. That would be the day when Israel's only power, the only power she ever had, her covenant relationship with God, was completely shattered. Zechariah 11, verse 8 and 9. Therefore, the day of the Lord, of the resurrection, was in AD 70, which, once again, means that the day of the Lord is not an earth-burning, time-ending event. Now, last week, I took you to Revelation chapter 10. Now, you see, what I just shared with you is all from Daniel chapter 12, right? I shared with you Revelation chapter 10, which tells us that John said in this vision, and I'm going to start reading with verse 5, Revelation chapter 10. The angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised up his hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, the earth and the things that are in it, and and the sea and all things that are in it. Watch. That there shall be delay no longer, but in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel. See, John has just seen 7 angels with 7 trumpets. In the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God would be finished as he declared to his servants, the prophets. Pardon me. Here it is, folks. In the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, everything that the prophets said was going to happen would be finished. And notice this, in the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet, there will be no more delay. Do you know that some Bible scholars down through history say, hey, look, we're just waiting for the sounding of the seventh trumpet. And that seventh trumpet will be a literal, audible blasting of the trumpet of Yahweh. Well, if that's true, if we're waiting for the seventh trumpet, and it's going to be an audible trumpet, Where did we hear the previous 6? There is no indication in Revelation that the first 6 were some kind of spiritual reality unheard by the human ear. So where do we come off getting the idea, okay, the first 6 trumpets have sounded, they were spiritual and unheard, but the seventh trumpet is a literal audible blast of the trumpet of God. There's no consistency here. That doesn't even make good sense. Doesn't even make good nonsense, as I sometimes say. Now, notice the sounding of that 7th trumpet. There will be no more delay. Now, there are some translations render this, not many, but some translations render this, there shall be no more time. And some who believe in an earth-burning, time-ending event of the day of the Lord and the resurrection say, well, you see, we have right here, pardon me, we have right here a very clear affirmation of the coming end of time. And there are just a tiny handful of translations that render it, time shall be no more. But unfortunately, that is simply not what the text, the Greek, actually says. I have the commentary by Greg Beale, who's one of the finest Greek scholars in the world. He's an amillennialist. And Greg Beale examines that claim that Revelation 10:7 is talking about the end of time. He analyzes the Greek. He analyzes the use of that Greek term throughout history, and he says there is simply no justification for the idea that Revelation 10:7 is predicting the end of time. The proper translation, the proper meaning of the original Greek is there will be no more delay, meaning that in the sounding of the 7th trumpet, the mystery of God, the time of the fulfillment of all prophecy would have arrived. No more delay. And folks, I'm out of time. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next week.